Okay, this will be video 2 for AP Euro for Wednesday, February 27th. All right, so we're now moving on to the Russian Revolution of 1905. By 1903, Russia had established a sphere of influence in Chinese Manchuria. So this goes back to U.S. history. If you recall, around the time of open door policy, America shows up and they find out Europeans have already established themselves to be very influential in China. There are 5 countries involved in this, Russia being one of them. So Russia basically controls these various ports in China. It's their sphere of influence. And the new czar in the mid-90s, Nicholas II, who will also be the last czar, so you can see him right here, Nicholas II will become the last czar of Russia, ignored Japan's diplomatic request of stop expanding. So basically, Russia was trying to expand more around China, the same areas Japan was trying to expand in as well, especially around Korea. Both were interested in expanding near and around Korea. And the new czar just basically ignored the things that Japan was warning about and so forth and so on. And so in 1904, the Japanese will declare war and attack Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. This war only lasted a year, but the Japanese were way better prepared. Japan was the most modernized, industrialized Asian country and was much better off industrial-wise than the Russians were, especially with their navy. They had a much more modern navy as well too. Well, the Russians get very embarrassed in this war. They lose a lot of attacks. One of their fleets will be destroyed in this war. But the war itself only goes on for about a year, and when it all ends by September of 1905, the Russians are very much embarrassed. But just like the Crimean War had done, it's kind of a signal that, hey, we need to make reforms back in Russia or things are going to get bad. And that's kind of what you need to know about the Russo-Japanese War. That and the fact that your old best friend, American, helped arbitrate the end of this in the Treaty of Portsmouth. Have you soon forgotten your friend, Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States, who goes on to win the Nobel Peace Prize for essentially arbitrating the deal into this war in 1905. Anyway, I digress. Demand for reforms. So the military disaster again led to a demand for change. The business and professional classes called for a liberal representative government. So the business and professional classes called for a liberal representative government. Urban factory workers were organized in a radical, still illegal labor movement. So a lot of urban factory workers were still organized in a radical and still illegal labor movement. Peasants also had gained very little since the reform started under Alexander II, and they still were suffering in poverty. Also, certain minorities were still calling for self-rule, especially like Poles, Ukrainians, and Latvians. So there was a lot of nationalities who wanted their independence, like Poles, Ukrainians, and Latvians. The army was also pinned down fighting against the Japanese in Manchuria in 1905. So a lot of civilians thought this was to be a great time to strike in terms of protests and pushing change. So this is going to lead to the Bloody Sunday Massacre in 1905. So in January of 2005, a massive crowd of workers did a peaceful protest in St. Petersburg in front of the Tsar's palace, in front of Winter Palace. So you're going to have this large protest a very peaceful protest in front of the Tsar's palace amongst a lot of these peasants, working class, priests are out there as well too. Suddenly the troops and guards opened fire and killed and wounded hundreds of protesters out in front of the palace. So it makes the Tsar look terrible. And this massacre produced a massive wave of indignation against the Tsar. So this produced a massive wave of indignation against the Tsar. People were very upset by what the Tsar had done and so forth. Anyway, so it's gonna lead to more calls for changes and more reforms and so forth. So by summer of 1905, strikes and political rallies, peasant uprisings, revolts among nationalists, and troop mutinies were sweeping the country. So things were getting unsettled and worse in Russia by the summer of 1905. Like we said, strikes and political rallies, peasant uprisings, revolts among nationalities, and troop mutinies were sweeping the country. The surge culminated in October 1905 with a paralyzing general strike. So there was a massive general strike in the country in 1905, which just really hurt the country. This led to Tsar Nicholas II to issue what he called the October Manifesto. The October Manifesto granted full civil rights and promised a popularly elected national parliament, or Duma. So the October Manifesto granted full civil rights for people and promised a popularly elected national parliament called the Duma. A lot of the middle class people were frightened by what might happen if they don't accept it, so they gave in, and this allowed the Tsar to basically get back control and now establish himself as a constitutional monarch, as opposed to losing the entire country to revolt. So he's going to create himself as a constitutional monarch going forward, and at least at first seemed like he's very much willing to go along with reforms, but he basically gets everybody to kind of go along with it and agree to it before he kind of rolls back and goes conservative again. So we'll look at the Duma structure. The Duma doesn't start officially until May of 2006. The government issued a new constitution called the Fundamental Laws. So they develop a national constitution called the Fundamental Laws. The Tsar still retained a lot of power. For the lower house was indirectly elected by universal male suffrage. The lower house of their Duma was indirectly elected by universal male suffrage. The upper house was appointed, so kind of very parliament-like from England. The Duma could debate and pass laws, but the Tsar had ultimate veto power. And the ministers were also appointed by the Tsar, kind of like you saw like in France. Okay, so it seems like at least there's going to be some liberal changes and some more representative government here at the national level, but there will be setbacks. So the middle-class liberals saw the fundamental laws as a step backwards. So the middle-class liberals saw the fundamental laws as a step backwards. Cooperation with Nicholas II's ministers broke down after the Duma began to try to pass more liberal modern reforms, and so that led to months of deadlock. After months of deadlock, Nicholas II decided to dismiss the Duma. This is where the rollbacks start. So this led the ministers to basically change everything and create, rework their constitution that would favor more conservatives. So this is going to lead to reworking the constitution with the ministers under Tsar Nicholas II to make the government more conservative. This is going to be led a lot by Peter Stolypin. Peter Stolypin, this guy right here, is going to be the leader of all these reforms that are taking place in Russia after Bloody Sunday and after the October Manifesto and all the Duma changes and so forth. They greatly increased the power of conservatives with property to win elections. And so in the next election that's held, the majority of people elected will be loyal monarchists, people loyal to the crown. Okay, so next looking at conservative changes, and that's where we're going to end this video. So the new conservative Duma going forward will do a lot of agrarian reforms that broke down a lot of the collective villages, like the communally shared villages. Ownership of land will stop being communally owned, and they encourage peasants to be more enterprising. The government also reformed education and banking, but there was a lot of harsh repression of dissidents and radicals. About 3,000 suspected revolutionaries were also executed under Stolypin. Stolypin will actually, the noose will be known as Stolypin's necktie because of how many people he killed using the hangman's noose whenever he was cracking down and repressing these people. So in 1914, Russia was partially modernized, but they had a very conservative constitutional monarchy with a peasant base, but a more industrialized economy. And they're just not really going to be well prepared for World War I when it all rolls around and starts. And we'll see that later on in period 4. So we're going to stop here and we'll do the rest tomorrow. Have a good day, and we'll see you at the